The explosion happened without warning. Dr. Kine had just finished explaining the crystalline structure to his colleagues when the containment field collapsed. The exotic matter reacted instantly, sending a shockwave through the laboratory that cracked walls and shattered every glass surface in the room. Alarms screamed throughout the research station, red lights flashing in every corridor. Dan Foster dropped his tablet and ran toward the source of the blast. His security training kicked in automatically. Check for survivors. Seal the breaches. Get everyone to the evacuation pods. He had done drills for this scenario 100 times, but drills never included the smell of burning metal or the way gravity flickered on and off like a broken light switch. Other crew members rushed past him, heading in the opposite direction. A Quillen engineer with 4 arms carried 2 injured scientists. A Brevian pilot dragged an unconscious human technician. Everyone moved with the same desperate energy, trying to reach safety before the station tore itself apart. Dan reached the science wing and stopped. The corridor ahead had collapsed completely. Twisted metal blocked the path and flames licked through the gaps. His radio crackled with panicked voices reporting damage from every section. Hull breaches in 3 zones, fire suppression systems failing, life support compromised. They had maybe 20 minutes before the station became a tomb. That was when he heard the screaming. It was not a human sound. The pitch was too high, too sharp. It cut through the alarm systems and made his teeth ache. Dan pressed his hands against his ears, but the sound seemed to vibrate inside his skull. Equipment around him started sparking. A nearby panel exploded in a shower of sparks. Through a cracked viewport, Dan saw movement. A small creature huddled in the corner of a damaged observation room. It was no bigger than a large dog, with scales that shimmered blue and silver. Wings, torn and bleeding, spread behind it. The baby Draconith opened its mouth and screamed again. The remaining windows in the room cracked further. Dan had seen adult Draconith before. They were impressive beings standing over 8 feet tall with wings that could span 20 feet. They were known across the galaxy as brilliant scientists and philosophers. But this was a child, terrified and alone. Its parent was nowhere in sight. The radio burst to life again. All personnel, this is Captain Brooke, final evacuation order. Everyone to the pods now. We have 15 minutes before core breach. I repeat, 15 minutes. Dan pressed his comm button. Captain, there is a child in Section 7, a Draconith juvenile. I can see him through the viewport. Static filled the line for a moment. Foster, that section is completely cut off. The structural integrity is failing. You need to evacuate now. The child is alive and conscious. I cannot just leave him. Dan, listen to me. That child's sonic scream will kill you before you get within 10 feet. Every rescue team we sent near that area has been forced back. We have tried. We lost 2 good people trying to reach that room. The parent, Dr. Kine, is trapped somewhere else in the science wing. We cannot reach either of them. Dan watched the baby Draconith through the window. It had stopped screaming for a moment. Its large eyes, golden and wet with tears, darted around the room. It was looking for its parent. Dan had 3 younger siblings back on Earth. He knew that look. Pure terror. I'm going in, Dan said. That is a direct order, Lieutenant Foster. Get to the evacuation pods. I understand, Captain. But I am going in anyway. He switched off his radio before she could respond. The other crew members had already passed through this corridor. He was alone now. Good. No one else needed to risk their lives for his decision. Dan studied the room's layout through the viewport. The door was jammed, but there was an access panel nearby. If he could reroute power to that section, maybe he could override the locks. He pulled the panel open and started working with the wires inside. His hands shook slightly. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through his system. The baby Draconith noticed him. It turned its head, tracking his movement. Dan froze. Those golden eyes locked onto his. For a moment, neither moved. Then the creature's mouth opened again. Dan braced himself. But this time the scream was different. Shorter, almost like a question. The baby was trying to communicate, Dan realized. It was not attacking. It was calling for help. "I know, little one," Dan said quietly, though the creature could not hear him through the reinforced glass. "I know you are scared. I am scared too. But I am going to get you out of there." The wires sparked in his hands. Dan yelped and pulled back, shaking his burned fingers. He looked at the timer on his suit's display. 12 minutes until core breach. The station groaned around him, metal screaming as structural supports failed one by one. Dan took a deep breath and went back to the wiring. He had done emergency repairs before. This was just another puzzle to solve. Just another problem with a solution. He refused to think about what would happen if he failed. The baby Draconith watched him work. It had stopped screaming now, just watching with those enormous eyes. Occasionally it would make a small chirping sound, almost like a bird. Despite its dragon-like appearance, despite the scales and wings and claws, it was just a frightened child. The lock clicked. The door slid open halfway, then stuck. But it was enough. Dan could squeeze through if he moved carefully. He grabbed an emergency kit from the wall and pulled out a breathing mask. The atmosphere in that room would be contaminated. He would need protection. Dan looked through the viewport one more time. The baby Draconith tilted its head, watching him. Waiting. "Here goes nothing," Dan muttered, and slipped through the door into the damaged observation room. The air inside the observation room tasted like copper and smoke. Dan squeezed through the jammed doorway and immediately felt the temperature difference. It was hot here, almost unbearable. His suit's cooling system kicked in automatically, but sweat still dripped down his face. The baby Draconith backed into the corner, wings spreading defensively. Its mouth opened and Dan knew what was coming. "Wait," Dan said, holding up both hands. "Please wait," the creature paused. Its throat vibrated, ready to scream, but something made it hesitate. Maybe it was Dan's calm voice. Maybe it was the way he kept his movements slow and deliberate. Dan had spent 2 years working in a children's hospital before joining the space program. He had learned that fear was universal, whether you had 2 legs or 4, whether you had skin or scales. Dan slowly removed his helmet. The action was stupid and dangerous. The air quality was terrible, and he would only have a few minutes before the toxins made him sick. But the baby needed to see his face. It needed to know he was not a threat. The Draconith's eyes widened. Its scales rippled with color changes, shifting from blue to purple to silver. Dan had read somewhere that Draconith expressed emotions through color shifts. He wished he had paid more attention to those briefings. "My name is Dan," he said softly. "I know you cannot understand me, but I am here to help. Your parent is looking for you. We need to get you somewhere safe." The creature made a sound, something between a whimper and a growl. Its injured wing dragged on the floor, leaving small streaks of silver blood. Dan's heart clenched. The poor thing was hurt and alone and probably thought it was going to die here. The station shuddered violently. Dan stumbled and caught himself against a broken console. The baby Draconith shrieked, but this time it was from fear, not attack. The sound still hurt Dan's ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting scared would only make things worse. Dan dug through his emergency kit with shaking hands. Medical supplies, water rations, a thermal blanket, emergency flares. Nothing particularly helpful for calming a terrified alien child. His fingers brushed against something small and square. He pulled it out and almost laughed. A bottle of soap solution. It was part of the standard kit for checking air leaks. You sprayed the soap on suspected breach points and looked for bubbles. Dan had used it dozens of times during maintenance checks. But now, looking at the bottle, a crazy idea formed in his mind. He uncapped the bottle and poured a small amount into his palm. Then he pulled out the attached wand and dipped it into the solution. With a gentle breath, he blew across the wand. Bubbles formed instantly, floating in the damaged room's reduced gravity. They drifted slowly through the air, catching the red emergency lights and reflecting them in rainbow patterns. Dozens of perfect spheres dancing through the toxic atmosphere like tiny planets. The baby Draconith stopped whimpering. Its head tracked the movement of the nearest bubble. Dan blew more, creating a stream of floating spheres that moved toward the creature. One bubble landed on its snout and popped with a tiny sound. The Draconith jumped back, startled. Then it made a noise that sounded almost like curiosity. It reached out with one small clawed hand and tapped another bubble. Pop. The creature chirped, a sound of pure surprise and delight. Dan felt his chest loosen slightly. "You like that?" "Yeah, I thought you might." He blew more bubbles, creating clouds of them. The baby Draconith began batting at them gently, each pop followed by an excited chirp. Its scales shifted to a bright turquoise color. Dan did not need a translation guide to understand that. The creature was happy. For 2 precious minutes, Dan knelt on the floor of a dying space station, blowing soap bubbles for an alien child. The absurdity of it struck him. Every logical part of his brain screamed that this was insane. They had maybe 10 minutes before the core exploded. He should be grabbing the creature and running. But his instinct told him something different. This child needed to trust him first. Without trust, it would fight him every step of the way and they would both die. The Draconith moved closer, no longer cowering in the corner. It watched Dan's face carefully, studying him. Then it did something unexpected. It tried to blow bubbles, too. Air whooshed from its nostrils, but of course nothing happened. It looked confused. Dan smiled despite everything. Here, like this. He demonstrated again, blowing slowly and steadily through the wand. The baby watched intently, then tried again. Still nothing. It made a frustrated sound. It is okay, Dan said. You are doing great. Want to try popping some more? He blew another stream of bubbles. The Draconith's eyes followed them with intense focus. Then carefully it stepped forward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. It was now within arm's reach of Dan. Dan's heart pounded, but he kept his expression calm and friendly. The creature reached out and gently touched his knee with 1 claw. The touch was feather-light, questioning. Dan stayed perfectly still. The baby Draconith leaned forward and sniffed his hand. Its nostrils flared, processing his scent. Then it made a decision. It climbed onto Dan's lap, curling up like an oversized cat. Its scales were warm against Dan's legs, and its breathing gradually slowed from panicked gasps to something more normal. There we go, Dan whispered. See, I am not so scary, am I? The creature nuzzled against his chest. Its injured wing folded awkwardly, and Dan carefully adjusted his arm to support it. The baby made a contented rumbling sound. Dan's radio crackled back to life. He had turned it off, but Captain Brooke must have overridden the shutdown. Foster, if you can hear this, you have 7 minutes. 7 minutes until core breach. Please respond. Dan pressed the button with his free hand. I hear you, Captain. I have the child. He is injured but alive. We are coming out now. Thank God, Dan, the parent is trapped in Medical Bay 12. Dr. Kine is alive but cannot move. The doors are sealed. Dan looked down at the baby Draconith in his arms. Medical Bay 12 was in the opposite direction from the evacuation pods. Going there would cost them precious time they did not have. But leaving the parent behind was not an option. This child had already been through enough trauma. Understood, Dan said. We will get Dr. Kine. All 3 of us are getting off this station. Dan, that is impossible. Probably, Dan agreed. But we are going to try anyway. He stood slowly, cradling the baby against his chest. The creature did not protest. It seemed content to stay with him now, trusting this strange human who made bubbles and spoke in a gentle voice. Dan grabbed his emergency kit and headed for the door. Time to do something really stupid. The corridor looked like a war zone. Debris floated in patches where gravity had failed completely. Exposed wiring sparked and hissed. A support beam had collapsed across the path, forcing Dan to crawl under it while protecting the baby Draconith cradled against his chest. The creature stayed quiet, occasionally making small chirping sounds that vibrated against Dan's ribs. Medical Bay 12 was 3 sections away. In normal conditions, it would take 5 minutes to walk there. But nothing about this situation was normal. Dan checked his suit display. 5 minutes until core breach. The math was not in their favor. He pulled himself through a damaged junction where the floor had buckled. The baby's claws dug into his suit. Not enough to puncture, but enough to show it was scared. Dan started humming without thinking about it. An old lullaby his mother used to sing. The tune was simple and repetitive. The Draconith's grip loosened slightly. Its scales shifted from dark purple to a softer lavender color. Dan kept humming, even though his lungs burned from the bad air and his muscles screamed from the exertion. The creature seemed to respond to the vibration of his voice. A secondary explosion rocked the station. Dan was thrown against a wall, his shoulder taking the impact. He grunted in pain, but managed to keep hold of the baby. The Draconith's mouth opened, ready to scream, but Dan immediately started humming again, louder this time. The creature's scream turned into a confused chirp instead. That is it, Dan panted. You are doing so well. Just stay calm for me. They reached Section 9. The door to Medical Bay 12 was visible down the hall, but fire blocked the path. Orange flames consumed everything, fed by a ruptured oxygen line. Dan's suit computer flashed warnings about the temperature. Going through that inferno would kill them both. Dan looked around desperately. There had to be another way. His eyes landed on a maintenance shaft above them. It was small, barely big enough for him to fit through, but it ran parallel to the corridor. If he could reach it, they could bypass the fire entirely. The problem was getting up there. Gravity was working in this section, and Dan had maybe 30 pounds of scared alien baby in his arms. He looked at the Draconith. "I need you to trust me, okay? I'm going to put you down for just a moment." The creature's eyes widened. It chirped anxiously and gripped his suit tighter. Dan understood. The last time someone put this baby down, everything had exploded and its parent had disappeared. Of course, it did not want to be abandoned again. "I am not leaving you," Dan said firmly. "I promise, look." He blew a few more soap bubbles, though his hands shook with exhaustion. The Draconith watched them float. "See, I'm still here. I am always going to be here. But I need both hands for just a minute." He gently set the baby down on a stable section of floor. The creature immediately began to whimper, scales flashing between purple and red. Dan worked as fast as he could, dragging over a piece of fallen equipment and stacking it beneath the maintenance shaft. He climbed up, forced the hatch open, then jumped back down. "Your turn, buddy." Dan picked up the Draconith again. The baby immediately stopped whimpering and buried its face against Dan's neck. "We are going to climb up there together. You hold on tight to me, okay? Do not let go." Dan climbed the makeshift steps one-handed, the other arm supporting the baby. His muscles burned. His vision swam. But he kept moving. At the top, he maneuvered them both into the shaft. It was a tight fit. Dan had to crawl on his belly, pushing forward with his elbows while the Draconith clung to his back. The metal was hot beneath them. Dan could smell his suit starting to melt. They had to move faster. He crawled harder, ignoring the pain in his shoulders and the way his lungs struggled with each breath. The baby made worried sounds but stayed quiet otherwise, as if it understood how serious their situation was. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, they reached another hatch. Dan kicked it open and tumbled out into a different corridor. This one was cooler, less damaged. Medical Bay 12 was directly ahead. Dan ran. His legs felt like rubber, and his head spun from oxygen deprivation, but he ran anyway. The bay doors were sealed tight, red emergency lights flashing above them. Dan slapped the control panel. Nothing happened. He tried his security override code. Still nothing. "Dr. Kine," Dan shouted. "Can you hear me?" A voice responded through the door's speaker, weak but clear. "Who is there?" "Lieutenant Dan Foster, Station Security. I have your child. He is safe." There was a sound like a sob. "My baby, is he hurt?" Dan looked down at the Draconith in his arms. "His wing is injured, but he is okay. I need to get this door open. Can you access the controls from inside?" "The system is dead. The door will not open." Dan's timer showed 3 minutes until core breach. 3 minutes to get the door open, get Dr. Kine, and somehow reach the evacuation pods. It was impossible. The baby Draconith suddenly squirmed in Dan's arms. It was looking at the door, scales flashing bright gold. It made a sound that started low in its chest and built rapidly. Dan realized what was about to happen. "Cover your ears," he shouted into the speaker. The baby opened its mouth and screamed. Not a scream of fear this time. This was different, focused. The sonic wave hit the door like a physical force. Metal groaned and buckled. The baby screamed again and the door cracked down the middle. A third scream and the door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Dr. Kine lay on a medical bed inside, one leg clearly broken. The adult Draconith was massive, easily 7 feet tall even while injured. Its scales were deep blue, darkening to black along its spine. Those same golden eyes as the baby, but filled with pain and desperation. The baby launched itself from Dan's arms and scrambled onto its parent's chest. Dr. Kine wrapped wings around the child, making crooning sounds. For a moment, Dan felt like an intruder on something private and sacred. Then Dr. Kine looked at him. "You saved my child." "We are not saved yet," Dan said. "Can you move at all?" "My leg is broken. I cannot walk." "Then I will carry you." Dan looked at the timer. 2 minutes. "Both of you." Dr. Kine's eyes widened. "That is not possible." I weigh over 300 pounds. Good thing adrenaline is a hell of a drug, Dan muttered. He grabbed a wheelchair from the corner, thanking every star in the galaxy that medical bays were equipped with them. Get in. Your baby can sit with you. Dr. Kine hesitated only a moment before maneuvering onto the chair with visible pain. The baby stayed pressed against its parent, scales now a calm turquoise. Dan grabbed the handles and ran. His body was beyond exhausted, running purely on willpower and fear. The wheelchair was not designed for speed, especially while carrying 2 Draconith, but Dan pushed it as hard as he could. They flew down corridors, bouncing over debris and swerving around fires. The evacuation pod bay appeared ahead. Captain Brooks' voice crackled through his radio. Dan, you have 60 seconds. Where are you? Approaching pod bay now.
He could see it.
1 pod remained, its door open like a welcoming mouth. 50 seconds. They crossed the threshold into the bay. 40 seconds. Dan pushed the wheelchair straight into the pod. 30 seconds. He jumped in after them and slammed the emergency close button. The door sealed. The pod launched automatically, explosive bolts firing it away from the dying station. Through the viewport, Dan watched as the research station tore itself apart in a silent bloom of fire and debris. They had made it. Somehow, impossibly, they had made it. The silence in the pod was deafening after hours of alarms and explosions. Dan collapsed against the wall, his entire body shaking. His suit was scorched and torn. Burns marked his arms where the heating had failed. But they were alive. All 3 of them were alive. He wanted to laugh or cry, or maybe both. Dr. Kine sat in the wheelchair, wings wrapped protectively around the baby. The adult Draconith's scales had shifted to a deep burgundy color, and its breathing was labored. The broken leg was swelling badly. Dan forced himself to move, pulling out the pod's medical kit. Let me look at that leg, Dan said. Dr. Kine watched him warily. Why did you do this? Humans and Draconith are not allies. Our species barely tolerate each other at diplomatic functions. Why would you risk your life for us? Dan knelt beside the wheelchair and carefully examined the injury. The break was clean, which was good. He pulled out a medical brace and some painkillers. Because your child was scared. Because leaving you both to die was not an option I could live with. That is not logical. Probably not, Dan agreed. He gently fitted the brace around Dr. Kine's leg. The Draconith hissed in pain but allowed him to work. But humans are not always logical. Sometimes we just do what feels right. The baby Draconith watched Dan with those huge golden eyes. It chirped softly, then reached out and touched Dan's burned arm with one gentle claw. Dan smiled despite the pain. I am okay, little one. Just some burns. Nothing serious. Dr. Kine's scales flickered with color changes Dan could not interpret. The adult Draconith seemed to be thinking hard about something. Finally it spoke. My child has named you. What? Draconith young choose names for important beings in their lives. They cannot speak yet, but they understand more than most species realize. My child has named you Bubble Singer. It is a term of deep affection in our culture. Dan felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I am honored. You should be. Draconith do not give names lightly. Dr. Kine paused. I have spent 3 decades studying humans from a distance. I thought I understood your species. You are violent, unpredictable, and far too emotional for serious scientific work. But you are also this. The Draconith gestured at Dan at the situation they had survived. You are impossible to categorize. We are just people, Dan said. Same as everyone else. We get scared. We make mistakes. But we try to do the right thing when it matters. The pod's communication system beeped. Captain Brooks' face appeared on the small screen. She looked exhausted but relieved. Foster, I am so glad to see you. All 3 of you. A rescue ship will reach your pod in approximately 4 hours. Medical teams are standing by. Thank you, Captain. We will be ready. Brooks' expression softened. Dan, what you did back there was the bravest and most foolish thing I have ever witnessed. You disobeyed direct orders? Yes, ma'am. I understand if there are consequences. Consequences. Brooke almost smiled. Dan, every species in the sector has been watching our emergency feeds. Your helmet camera recorded everything. Every moment of you making bubbles for that baby. Every second of the rescue. You have become the most famous human in the galaxy in the last hour. Dan blinked. What? The footage is everywhere. Millions of beings across dozens of species have seen you risk everything for a Draconith child. Do you understand what this means? Humans have always been seen as dangerous outsiders. But now, She shook her head in wonder. Now they are calling you the bubble singer. They are calling humans the caretakers. Everything just changed, Dan. The screen went dark. Dan sat in stunned silence. He had not been thinking about politics or interspecies relations. He had just been trying to save a child. The idea that it meant something larger had not even occurred to him. The baby Draconith climbed out of its parents' embrace and into Dan's lap again. It was apparently deciding that Dan was its new favorite person. The creature nuzzled against his chest and began making contented rumbling sounds. Dr. Kine watched this with an unreadable expression. My child has never trusted strangers before. Draconith young are taught to be cautious, but with you there was no hesitation once you earned its trust with your bubbles. Play is universal, Dan said, gently stroking the baby's scales. They were softer than he expected, warm and smooth. Kids are kids no matter what species. They need to feel safe. They need to know someone cares about them. Your species understands children, Dr. Kine said slowly. Not just human children. All children. This is your gift. Dan had never thought about it that way, but maybe Dr. Kine was right. Humans had spent thousands of years raising young. Maybe that instinct translated across species boundaries in ways other races could not replicate. The next few hours passed slowly. Dan dozed occasionally, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The baby Draconith slept curled in his lap, occasionally chirping in its dreams. Dr. Kine rested with closed eyes but never truly slept, always keeping one eye on the child. When the rescue ship arrived, Dan was almost reluctant to leave the pod. This small space had become a strange sanctuary, but medical teams were waiting and Dr. Kine's leg needed proper treatment. The ship's doctor was a Quillan named Tess with 4 arms and a kind face. She immediately took charge, getting Dr. Kine onto a proper medical bed and administering stronger painkillers. The baby Draconith refused to leave Dan's side, clinging to him even as Tess tried to examine its injured wing. It seems you have made a permanent friend, Tess said with amusement. This little one will not let anyone else near it. Dan sat patiently while Tess worked around him, treating the baby's wing. The membrane was torn but would heal with time. She gave the baby something for the pain, and it immediately relaxed against Dan, scales turning a sleepy gray color. News crews were waiting when they docked at the nearest station. Dan had not expected that. Cameras from a dozen different species pointed at him as he carried the sleeping Draconith off the ship. Questions came from every direction, in multiple languages he could not understand. Captain Brooke appeared beside him, guiding him through the chaos. Keep walking. Do not answer anything yet. We need to get you to medical. But Dan stopped when he saw the crowd. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species had gathered. They were not threatening. They were cheering. Signs in various languages held messages he could not read, but the meaning was clear. They were celebrating. A small human child broke through the crowd, running up to Dan with her mother close behind. The girl held out a bottle of bubble solution. For the baby dragon, she said shyly. Dan felt tears sting his eyes. He took the bottle carefully. Thank you. That is very kind. The baby Draconith woke up enough to see the bottle. It chirped excitedly, recognizing what it was. The crowd laughed, a sound of pure joy that transcended species. Maybe Captain Brooke was right. Maybe everything had changed. Dan looked down at the small creature in his arms, at this baby who had somehow become the bridge between species, and he smiled. Everything had changed, and somehow that felt exactly right. The investigation took 3 weeks. Dan sat in a comfortable chair in a borrowed apartment on Station Haven, watching news coverage from across the galaxy. Every channel showed the same footage. Him making bubbles, him carrying the baby Draconith, him pushing Dr. Kine in the wheelchair while the station exploded behind them. The video had been watched billions of times. But Dan was not watching himself. He was watching the responses. A Brevian mother sent a video of her children making bubbles and giggling. A Quillan teacher incorporated bubble play into her classroom. A Targon ambassador, whose species was known for being cold and logical, admitted publicly that the footage had moved him to tears. Humans were receiving more diplomatic invitations in 1 month than they had in the previous decade. Trade agreements were being proposed. Cultural exchange programs were forming, all because Dan had made soap bubbles for a scared child. The door chimed. Dan opened it to find Dr. Kine standing there with the baby, who immediately chirped excitedly at seeing Dan. The adult Draconith still used a cane for the healing leg but moved much better now. "May we come in?" Dr. Kine asked formally. "Of course." Dan stepped aside and the baby immediately launched itself at him. Dan caught it with practiced ease. The little Draconith had grown slightly in the past weeks, but it still loved being held. "How are you both doing?" "My leg heals well. My child grows stronger every day." Dr. Kine settled into a chair carefully. "I came to discuss something important. The Galactic Council wishes to meet with you." Dan had been avoiding thinking about that. "I know. They have sent several requests. They want to offer you a position, a new role they are creating specifically for humans. They are calling it the Interspecies Youth Development Initiative. They want humans to teach other species how to better understand and care for children across species boundaries." "That is a big job," Dan said slowly. The baby Draconith played with his fingers, occasionally trying to bite them gently. "I am just a security officer who got lucky." "No," Dr. Kine said firmly. "You are something more. You saw my child not as an alien but as a being in need. That perspective is rare. Most species only understand their own young. But humans seem to have an instinct for all young creatures." Dan thought about his siblings, about his time in the children's hospital, about every frightened kid he had ever comforted. Maybe Dr. Kine had a point. What would this job involve? Teaching, research, creating protocols for interspecies childcare. There are millions of mixed-species families in the galaxy now. Draconith children with Brevian adoptive parents. Krillin young raised on human colonies. But no one has studied how to bridge these gaps. Until now, most assumed it was impossible. The baby started humming, mimicking the sound Dan had made in the corridor. It was off-key and wobbly, but recognizably a tune. Dan felt his heart melt. "You are getting so good at that, buddy." Dr. Kine's scales shifted to warm gold. "My child asks about you constantly. Bubble singer this, bubble singer that. You have become family in its mind. In Draconith culture, that means something profound. You saved its life, yes. But more than that, you taught it that kindness can exist between different beings. Any decent person would have done the same thing. Perhaps, but most beings did not. They ran to save themselves. You ran toward danger to save a stranger's child. That matters." A news alert appeared on Dan's screen. He glanced at it and froze. "Dr. Kine, you should see this." The doctor moved to look at the screen. The headline read, "5 more species approve human integration programs. Polls show approval ratings at historic highs." Below the text were images. A human volunteer teaching Brevian children to read. A human doctor working in a Quillen hospital. A human engineer helping rebuild infrastructure on a Targon colony. Everywhere, humans were being welcomed. 3 weeks ago, most of these species refused to allow humans on their worlds, Dr. Kine said quietly. Now they are inviting them, requesting them, all because people watched you refuse to abandon my child. Dan felt the weight of that. One action, one decision made in desperation, had changed the entire galaxy's perception of humanity. It was almost too big to process. The baby Draconith tugged on Dan's shirt. It held up its small claws and made a motion like blowing. Dan understood immediately. He pulled out the bottle of bubble solution the little girl had given him. He always carried it now. He blew a stream of bubbles. The baby laughed, a sound like wind chimes, and began batting at them. Some popped. Some floated away. Each one brought the same joy. Dr. Kine watched with an expression Dan was learning to read. Contentment mixed with something deeper. I have spent my entire career studying quantum mechanics. I have published papers that changed our understanding of the universe, but I never understood the most important thing until you showed me. What is that? That the smallest actions can have the biggest impacts. A bubble is nothing. Air and soap and water, but to a frightened child it is everything. It is hope. It is play. It is proof that good still exists in the universe. Dan had not thought about it in those terms, but Dr. Kine was right. Those bubbles had meant nothing and everything at the same time. Will you take the position? Dr. Kine asked. Will you help us learn what you already know? Dan looked at the baby Draconith playing with bubbles. He thought about all those images on the news. Human volunteers making differences in alien lives. Human compassion bridging gaps that had existed for centuries. Yes, Dan said, I will take it. But I have one condition. Name it. This little one comes with me sometimes. If I am going to teach others about caring for children across species, I need a living example. Plus, I have gotten kind of attached. The baby chirped happily as if it understood and approved. Dr. Kine's scales rippled with colors Dan now recognized as amusement and affection. Agreed. My child would never forgive me if I separated it from its bubble singer. Dr. Kine stood slowly, leaning on the cane. I should let you rest. We have a meeting with the council tomorrow. They will want details about your plans. Wait, Dan said. I never asked your child's name. Its real name, not the nickname it gave me. Dr. Kine made a sound that Dan's translator could not process. In your language, the closest translation would be Rising Dawn over Crystal Waters. But you may call my child Dawn, it is simpler. Dawn, Dan repeated. The baby perked up at hearing its name. That is beautiful. After they left, Dan stood at the window looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there were billions of beings who had watched him make bubbles for a scared child. They had seen something in that moment, something that changed how they viewed humans. Dan had never wanted to be famous. He had never wanted to change the galaxy. He had just wanted to help a frightened kid. But sometimes he was learning. The smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways you could never predict. He thought about his new job. Teaching aliens how to care for children, creating protocols and programs, building bridges between species through something as simple as understanding that fear is universal and comfort transcends biology. It was a big responsibility. But as he watched Dawn playing in the room next door through the window, saw Dr. Kine watching its child with obvious love, Dan felt ready. Sometimes changing the world started with making bubbles. 2 years had passed since the disaster. Dan stood in the center of the new Interspecies Youth Development Center, watching chaos in the best possible way. 30 children from 15 different species played together in the zero-gravity playground. A young Brevian floated past, laughing as soap bubbles surrounded her. A Targon child, whose species was known for being serious and reserved, giggled while chasing the bubbles. A human toddler held hands with a Quillan youth, both trying to pop the same bubble at once. Dawn, now almost 4 years old and much bigger, supervised the younger children with surprising gentleness. The young Draconith had appointed itself as the unofficial guardian of the playroom. Its wing had healed perfectly, and it often flew lazy circles around the room, keeping watch over the little ones. They look happy, a voice said beside him. Dan turned to see Dr. Kine, who no longer needed the cane. The doctor visited the center often, sometimes to help with research, sometimes just to spend time with Dawn. Their relationship had evolved over 2 years from rescued and rescuer to something closer to colleagues and friends. They are happy, Dan agreed. 6 months ago, half these species refused to let their children near each other. Now look at them. You did this, Dr. Kine said. Your research, your protocols, your training programs. 50 centers like this one exist now across the galaxy. Thousands of children learning that differences do not have to mean division. Dan shook his head. I just showed people that kids are kids. They want to play. They want to feel safe. They want to know someone cares. Those things do not change whether you have scales, fur, or skin. A small Brevian child approached, tugging on Dan's sleeve. Teacher Dan, can you show us the new bubble trick? Of course. Dan pulled out his bottle, which he had upgraded to a professional model with multiple wands. He demonstrated a technique that created long, tube-shaped bubbles. The children gasped in wonder, and soon a crowd had formed around him. Dawn flew down and landed beside Dan. The young Draconith had learned to make bubbles too, in a fashion. By breathing very gently through a wand, Dawn could create streams of bubbles that floated away. The younger children loved it. Bubble Singer and Dawn, the dynamic duo, a human teacher named Lisa said with a smile. She was one of 50 humans now working in these centers. More joined every month as the program expanded. Dr. Kine's communicator beeped. The doctor checked it and smiled. The council has approved funding for 20 more centers. They also want you to present your findings at the Galactic Science Summit next month. Me? I am not a scientist. I am just a guy who worked security and played with kids. You are the foremost expert in interspecies child development, Dr. Kine corrected. Your paper on universal play patterns was downloaded 10 million times. Your protocols are being taught in universities across 30 systems. You are exactly who should present. Dan still struggled with the idea that he was some kind of expert. He had just done what felt natural. But the results spoke for themselves. Before his work, mixed species families struggled terribly. Children felt isolated. Parents felt helpless. Now they had resources. They had support. They had hope. A chime indicated snack time. The children flew or walked or hopped to their designated areas, depending on their species' needs. Dan watched to make sure everyone was settled. A young Targan child sat alone, not eating. Dan floated over. "Hey there, not hungry?" The child, whose name was Gron, shook his head. His skin, which should have been a healthy gray color, looked pale. "I miss home," Dan understood. Gron's family had relocated for work, and the young Targon was struggling with the transition. His species did not typically show emotion, but Dan had learned to read the small signs. The way Gron's shoulders hunched. The way he avoided eye contact. "Home misses you too," Dan said gently. "But you know what? Home is not just a place. It is the people who care about you. Your family is here, and we are here too. We care about you." "Really?" "Really." Dan pulled out a small device. "I have been working on something new. Want to see?" He activated the device and holographic bubbles appeared, dancing through the air. But these bubbles were special. They showed images inside them. Gron's home planet, his favorite foods, familiar places. Gron's eyes widened. "That is my world. I thought it might help to see home sometimes. These bubbles are yours to keep. Whenever you miss home, you can look at them." The young Targon reached out to touch a holographic bubble. It popped, but the image remained for a moment, floating in the air. Gron made a sound that Dan's translator identified as Targon laughter. Dawn flew over to investigate. The young Draconith had become protective of all the children, regardless of species. Dawn nuzzled against Gron gently, making comforting sounds. "See?" Dan said. "You have got friends here. You are not alone." Gron nodded, looking more relaxed. He finally started eating his snack while watching the holographic bubbles dance around him. Dr. Kine had watched the entire interaction. "You have a gift. The way you read children, understand what they need before they can articulate it. Most beings require years of training to develop such intuition. You simply have it." "I just remember what it felt like to be scared when I was young," Dan said. "All kids feel that way sometimes. Our job is to help them feel safe again." The day continued with its organized chaos. Reading time, where children listened to stories from different cultures. Art time, where young beings created masterpieces with whatever appendages they had. Music time, where Dawn's humming had become a favorite activity. As the day ended and parents arrived to collect their children, Dan felt the familiar sense of satisfaction. Every child who left smiling was a small victory. Every parent who looked less stressed was progress. The last child left and Dawn curled up on a cushion, exhausted from playing guardian all day. Dr. Kine sat beside Dan in the observation room, watching the young Draconith sleep. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not gone back for my child?" Dr. Kine asked. Dan had thought about it sometimes in quiet moments. Dawn would not be here. You would not be here. But more than that, none of this would exist. The centers, the programs, the changed relationships between species. It all came from one decision. One illogical, dangerous, beautiful decision, Dr. Kine corrected. You risked everything for a stranger's child. That should not make sense, but it does. It makes perfect sense in ways my species is only beginning to understand. Empathy is not illogical, Dan said. It is just a different kind of logic, one that values life and connection over pure calculation. Dr. Kine's scales shifted to warm gold. The color Dan had learned meant deep affection. My people are changing because of you. We are learning to value emotional intelligence as highly as we value scientific intelligence. It is revolutionary. Emotions and science work together, Dan said. You need both. Logic tells you what is possible. Emotion tells you what is right. Dawn stirred, making sleepy chirping sounds. The young Draconith had grown so much but still loved to sleep near Dan. It was a connection that went beyond species, beyond logic. It was simply love. Dan's communicator showed a message from Captain Brooke. She checked in regularly, proud of what her former officer had accomplished. The message was simple. Saw the news about the new centers. Well done, Bubble Singer. You changed the galaxy. Dan smiled. He had not set out to change anything. He had just wanted to help one scared child. But that one action had rippled outward in ways he never imagined. Through the window, Dan could see the stars. Billions of beings lived among those lights. Different species, different cultures, different ways of thinking. But they all had one thing in common. They all had children who needed care, comfort, and hope. And now, thanks to soap bubbles and a human's refusal to leave a child behind, those children had a better chance at understanding each other. Dawn woke up fully and flew over to Dan, landing on his shoulder. The young Draconith nuzzled against his cheek affectionately. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Dan asked. Dawn chirped agreement. Dr. Kine stood as well. The three of them left the center together. An unlikely family formed in disaster and strengthened through love. As they walked through the station, other beings nodded respectfully. Some smiled. A few waved. Dan was recognized everywhere now, but he had never gotten used to it. He was just someone who made bubbles and cared about kids, but to the galaxy he was the bubble singer. The human who proved that kindness was universal, the one who showed that the smallest acts could create the biggest changes. And somewhere in the galaxy, a child was learning to make bubbles. Learning that differences were beautiful. Learning that empathy transcended species. The disaster had tried to destroy everything, but from that destruction came something better. Something hopeful. Something that proved beyond any doubt that humanity's greatest strength was not technology or violence. It was the simple ability to care. To see a frightened child and respond with kindness. To make bubbles and watch fear turn to joy. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy, and the galaxy was better for it.